Hansel and Gretel. There were once two children named Hansel and Gretel, brother and sister, who lived with their father at the edge of a great forest. Their house was small. Food did not last long. When evening came, the cupboards were empty more often than not, and the fire burned low. At night, the forest pressed close. The wind moved through the trees and brushed against the walls as though listening. One evening, after the fire had dimmed, Hansel and Gretel lay awake and heard their parents speaking in low voices. They spoke slowly, carefully, as people do when there are no good choices left. They spoke of the forest. Hansel waited until the house was quiet. Then he slipped outside and gathered small white stones that lay pale beneath the moon. He filled his pockets until they were heavy. In the morning, the family walked into the forest together. The trees closed behind them as they went. As they walked, Hansel let the stones fall from his pockets, one by one. When the parents turned back and left them there, the children waited. Night came. The stones caught the moonlight, shining softly among the roots and leaves. Hansel and Gretel followed them home, step by step, until the house stood before them again. For a time, things were quiet. Then the cupboards emptied once more. Another morning came. This time there was no chance to gather stones. Hansel broke a piece of bread and scattered crumbs along the path as they walked. Birds watched from the branches above. By nightfall, they were alone again. When they turned back, the crumbs were gone. They walked until their feet ached and their voices grew hoarse. The forest did not open. It did not answer. It simply remained. On the third day, they came upon a small house deep among the trees. Its walls were made of bread and cake. The roof glistened with sugar. Hunger overcame caution. They broke pieces away and ate. The door opened. An old woman stood there, bent and smiling. She spoke gently and beckoned them inside. The table was set. The fire was warm. Soft beds waited. By morning, Hansel was locked in a small wooden cage near the wall. Each day, the woman brought him food and reached through the bars to feel his finger. Hansel held out a thin bone. The woman frowned, drew her hand back, and turned again to the fire. Each day she returned. Each day she frowned again. Gretel was not locked away. She carried water, swept the floor, and kept the hearth burning. The woman watched the oven closely, testing its heat with practiced hands. One morning, the woman grew impatient. She called Gretel to the oven. "Climb inside," she said, "and see if it is hot enough." Gretel stood still. She said she did not know how. Annoyed, the woman leaned forward, peering into the dark mouth of the oven. Gretel pushed. The door slammed shut. The fire roared. Gretel ran to the cage and broke it open. Hansel stepped out. Together they searched the house and filled their pockets with jewels and gold. They fled into the forest. This time they did not mark the path. They walked until the trees thinned and the light changed. At last, familiar ground appeared beneath their feet, and the house stood waiting at the forest's edge. Their father was there. Nothing more was said. Hansel and Gretel stayed. The forest remained where it always had. Rumpelstiltskin. There was once a miller who liked to speak more than he liked to think. One day, standing before the king, he boasted that his daughter could spin straw into gold. The king did not laugh. He ordered the girl brought to the castle at once. That night, the miller's daughter was locked inside a stone room filled from floor to ceiling with straw. A spinning wheel stood in the centre. "If you can do what your father claims," the king said, "you will live. If not..." Nothing more was said. The door closed. The girl sat down and wept. She did not know how to spin straw into gold, and the night was long. Then someone knocked. A small man stepped into the room. He wore odd clothes and smiled as though he knew something she did not. "What will you give me," he asked, "if I spin this straw into gold for you?" She gave him her necklace. By morning, the straw was gone. Gold lay in its place. The king was pleased, but not satisfied. The next night, the girl was placed in a larger room,
with more straw. Again she wept. Again the little man appeared. This time she gave him her ring. By morning, more gold filled the room. On the third night, the king brought her to the largest room of all. If you succeed, he said, you will become my queen. The girl had nothing left to give. When the little man came, she promised him something instead. Her first child. He smiled. The straw became gold. The girl became queen. Time passed. When her child was born, the little man returned. The queen begged him to take gold instead. He refused. At last, he agreed to give her a chance. If you can tell me my name within 3 days, he said, you may keep the child. If not, he would return. The queen searched everywhere. On the first day, she guessed names she already knew. On the second, she sent messengers across the land to gather names she did not. Each guess was wrong. On the third day, a messenger returned from the forest. He had seen a strange little man dancing by a fire, singing, "Today I bake, tomorrow I brew. The queen's child soon I'll have too. For no one knows, and no one can guess, that Rumpelstiltskin is my name, yes." That evening, the little man returned. The queen spoke his name. At once, his smile vanished. He stamped his foot so hard that the floor cracked beneath him. Then he was gone. The queen kept her child. She did not speak of straw or gold again, and the king never asked. Snow White. There was once a queen who owned a mirror. It was a tall mirror set in a black frame, and every morning the queen stood before it and asked the same question: "Who is the fairest in the land?" And every morning the mirror answered her. For many years it said the queen's name. Then, one morning, it did not. It spoke another. Snow White was the queen's stepdaughter. She had grown quietly, without ceremony. She did not seek attention. She did not compare herself. She simply
was. When the mirror spoke her name, the Queen said nothing at first. She stood very still, listening to the words settle. Then she called for the huntsman. The huntsman was given clear instructions. He was to take Snow White into the forest. He was not to bring her back. He was to return with proof. Snow White walked beside him without fear. She trusted easily, as children often do. Deep among the trees, the huntsman stopped. He could not do what he had been asked. He told Snow White to run. He told her not to look back. She ran. The forest was wide and confusing, but it did not chase her. It stood, as forests do, letting her pass through it. By evening, she found a small house with a low door and 7 tiny beds inside. She ate a little. She drank a little. She lay down. When the owners returned, they were surprised, but not unkind. They were 7 dwarfs who worked in the mountains and slept little. They listened to Snow White's story and agreed she could stay as long as she was careful. "Do not open the door for anyone," they said. Snow White promised. Back at the castle, the Queen stood before her mirror again. Again, the mirror spoke Snow White's name. The Queen did not shout. She planned. The first time, she came as a peddler with laces to sell. Snow White forgot the warning and opened the door. The Queen pulled the laces tight, and Snow White fell still. The dwarfs returned and loosened them. Snow White breathed again. They warned her more sternly. The second time, the Queen came with a comb. Snow White opened the door. The comb was placed in her hair, and she fell still once more. The dwarfs returned and removed it. Snow White woke. They warned her again. The third time, the Queen came with an apple. It was red and white and looked harmless. Snow White hesitated. The Queen bit one half and smiled. Snow White bit the other. She fell. This time, she did not wake. The dwarfs placed her in a glass coffin. They could not bury her. She looked unchanged, as though resting between breaths. Time passed. One day, a prince travelling through the land saw the coffin and stopped. He looked at Snow White and recognized her, though they had never met. As the coffin was lifted, it tipped. The piece of apple dislodged. Snow White breathed. She did not rush. She did not cry out. She sat up slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep, and looked around. The prince asked her to come away with him, and she agreed. At the castle, the queen stood before her mirror once more. It did not speak her name. When she arrived at the wedding feast, she recognized Snow White at once. The end came swiftly. There was no return to the mirror. Snow White lived on. She remembered the forest. She remembered the house. She remembered the coffin. She did not forget what beauty had cost her. And the mirror, at last, had nothing left to say. The Frog Prince. There was once a young princess who spent her days walking in the palace gardens. She liked the sound of water and the feeling of cool stone beneath her hands. Of all the things she owned, her favourite was a small golden ball, smooth and bright from years of use. Each afternoon, she tossed it into the air and caught it again, walking slowly beside the well at the far end of the garden. One day, she missed. The ball struck the stone edge and dropped straight into the well. The princess leaned over and listened, but the sound of it falling was already gone. She sat down and wept. From the water below came a voice. "Why are you crying?" The princess looked into the well. A frog sat just above the surface, his eyes round and unblinking. "My golden ball has fallen in," she said, "and I cannot reach it." "I can," said the frog. She looked at him doubtfully. "What will you give me," he asked, "if I bring it back?" She promised him anything he wanted. Her jewels, her clothes, her crown if he wished. The frog shook his head. "I do not want those things," he said. "I want to be your companion. I want to sit beside you at your table and sleep near your bed." The princess agreed at once. She was thinking only of the ball. The frog dove into the well and returned with it, wet and gleaming. The princess took it and ran back to the palace without another word. The frog watched her go. That evening, as the princess sat at supper, there came a knock at the door. The frog hopped inside. "I have come for what you promised," he said.
The princess drew back. "He is only a frog," she said to her father, the king. "Must I really keep such a promise?" The king looked at her steadily. "What you have promised in need," he said, "you must keep." The frog was placed beside her plate. She ate slowly. That night, the frog followed her to her room. "I will sleep here," he said. The princess was angry and afraid. At last, in her frustration, she seized the frog and threw him against the stone wall. There was a sharp sound. The frog fell to the floor. Where he lay now stood a young man. He wore fine clothes and looked at the princess without anger. "I was cursed," he said, "to live as a frog until someone kept their promise to me." The princess stood very still. The king was called. By morning, the curse was broken. The prince explained that a spell had been placed upon him long ago, and that only a promise freely made and fulfilled could undo it. The frog shape had been a small part of the spell, not its punishment. The princess listened. She did not excuse herself. A carriage arrived to take the prince back to his kingdom. As it set off, the carriage driver laughed and shouted with joy. 3 times the carriage cracked loudly as they travelled. The princess feared the wheels were breaking. "No," said the prince, "that is my servant's heart breaking from happiness." The princess left the garden behind. She did not return often to the well. She learned to weigh her words more carefully and to keep them. And the frog was never seen there again.
The 12 Dancing Princesses. There was once a king who had 12 daughters. They slept each night in the same chamber, in 12 beds set side by side. Each evening, the doors were locked from the outside, and each morning, when the doors were opened again, the king found their shoes worn thin. The soles were scuffed, the ribbons frayed, as though they had been danced in all night. The princesses said nothing. The king asked where they had gone. They smiled and said they had slept. But the shoes told a different story. Each morning, new shoes were bought. Each night, the doors were locked. Each morning, the shoes were worn again. The king did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply waited and watched and wondered. At last, he announced that anyone who could discover where his daughters went each night would be rewarded, but if they failed, they would not return home. Many tried. They were given a bed in the outer room and told to listen. But each night, sleep came over them heavily. Their eyes closed. Their thoughts slowed. By morning, they remembered nothing. The shoes were worn again. Then, one evening, a quiet soldier came to the palace. He had been travelling for a long time and had learned how easily people drifted into sleep when they should not. He asked only to be allowed to stay awake. That night, he was given a cup to drink. He poured it away unseen and lay still. When the room grew quiet, the princesses rose. They dressed without speaking. They laughed softly, as if not to wake the walls. One by one, they touched the floor, and a place opened beneath them. A stairway descended, smooth and worn, as though many feet had passed there before. The soldier followed at a distance. Down they went, into a long passage lit by lamps that never flickered. The air was cool and steady. At the end of the passage stood a forest of silver leaves, and beyond it a river that flowed without sound. Boats waited. The princesses stepped into them, and the water carried them forward. Music drifted from the far shore. Not loud, not fast, but constant. On the other side stood a hall. Inside, the light never changed. The floor was smooth. The music never stopped. And there, night after night, the princesses danced. They danced without hurry. They danced without joy. They danced as though it was simply what was done. When the music ended, they returned the way they had come. Up the stairs, into their beds, before morning. The soldier returned with them and lay down as if he had never moved. When the king was told, he listened quietly. The princesses did not deny it. The doors were closed for the last time. The shoes were no longer brought. And somewhere beneath the palace, the lamps continued to burn, the river continued to flow, and the hall remained waiting, silent now and empty. The Elves and the Shoemaker. There was once a shoemaker who lived with his wife in a small house at the edge of a town. For many years, he had worked hard and earned enough. But slowly, his trade failed him. Customers stopped coming. Leather grew expensive. Coin grew scarce. At last, he only had enough leather to make one final pair of shoes. That evening, he cut the leather carefully and laid the pieces on his workbench. Then he went to bed, intending to finish his shoes in the morning. When he rose the next day and went to his workshop, he stopped in surprise. There, on the bench, stood a pair of shoes. They were finished. And not only finished, they were well made. The stitching was neat, the shape was true, and the leather shone. The shoemaker said nothing. He placed the shoes in the window. Before noon, a customer bought them for a good price. With the money, the shoemaker bought leather for 2 more pairs of shoes. That night, he cut the leather and laid it out as before. In the morning, 2 pairs of shoes stood on the bench, finished and polished. Again, they sold at once. Day after day, the same thing happened. The shoemaker cut the leather at night. In the morning, the shoes were done. Soon, he had enough money to work comfortably again. His house grew warmer. His table grew fuller. But he could not understand how the work was being done. One evening, he said to his wife, "We should stay awake tonight and see who is helping us." They hid quietly in the corner of the workshop and waited. At midnight, the door creaked open. 2 little elves stepped inside. They wore no shoes and very little clothing. They climbed onto the bench and set to work at once, sewing, hammering, and shaping with great skill and speed. By the time the clock struck 1, the shoes were finished. The elves bowed to the bench and slipped away. The shoemaker and his wife watched in silence. The next morning, the wife said, "They help us, but they have nothing. We should do something for them." Together, they made small clothes, jackets, shirts, and trousers, and tiny shoes to match. That night, they laid the clothes on the bench instead of leather. At midnight, the elves returned. They stopped and stared. They picked up the clothes and put them on at once. They laughed and danced about the room, clapping their hands. Then they bowed, not to the bench this time, but to the shoemaker's door. From that day on, the shoemaker prospered by his own work. He never became rich, but he had enough. And sometimes, when his stitching went particularly well, he thought of small feet moving quickly across the bench and smiled.
The Golden Goose. There was once a man who had 3 sons. The 2 eldest were clever and sharp-tongued, and they knew it. The youngest was quiet, slow to speak, and often overlooked. Everyone called him Simpleton, and he did not argue with the name. Each day, the eldest sons went out to work in the forest. Each day, their mother packed them fine food and drink. Before the first son reached the trees, an old grey man met him on the path. "Will you share your meal with me?" the old man asked. The son laughed. "I need it for myself," he said, and walked on. Before long, his axe slipped and cut his leg. He went home angry and empty-handed. The next day, the second son set out with food just as fine. The same old man met him. The second son refused him too. Before long, his work went badly, and he returned home with nothing. On the third day, Simpleton asked if he might go to the forest as well. His parents hesitated, then gave him a small piece of bread and a little sour beer. On the path, the old man appeared again. "Will you share what you have?" he asked. Simpleton sat down at once. They ate together, and when they were done, the old man said, "Go to the old oak and cut into it." Simpleton did as he was told. Inside the tree sat a goose with feathers of pure gold. Simpleton took the goose and set off for home. On the way, he stopped at an inn. The innkeeper's daughter saw the golden feathers and reached out to pluck one. Her hand stuck fast. A second daughter tried to pull her free. She stuck fast too. Soon the innkeeper himself joined them, and then a servant, and then a passing traveller. All were stuck together in a long line, unable to let go. Simpleton did not stop. He walked on, the line following behind him. They passed through villages and fields. People laughed and stared. Some people tried to help and were caught as well. Others stepped quickly aside. By evening, they had reached the city where the king lived. The king had a daughter who never laughed. He had promised that whoever made her laugh could marry her. Many had tried, none had succeeded. When Simpleton entered the courtyard with his strange procession, the princess watched from the window. At first she frowned, then she smiled, then she laughed. She laughed until she could not stop. The king was troubled. He did not wish his daughter to marry a boy like Simpleton. So he set tasks instead. First, Simpleton was told to bring a man who could drink a whole cellar of wine. Simpleton went out and met the old grey man again. Soon the cellar was empty. Next, he was told to find a man who could eat a mountain of bread. Again, the old man appeared. The bread vanished. Finally, the king demanded a ship that could travel on land and sea. The old man provided it. The king could delay no longer. Simpleton married the princess. The golden goose was freed. The old man was not seen again. And Simpleton, who had never hurried and never refused what little he had, lived as king. Still quiet, still steady, and no longer overlooked. Little Red Riding Hood. There was once a girl known as Little Red Riding Hood, named for the red cloak she wore whenever she left her home. She lived at the edge of a village where the houses thinned and the forest began. The path through the forest was narrow and well worn, pressed into the ground by years of careful footsteps. One morning, her mother filled a basket with bread and cake. "Take this to your grandmother," she said. "She is unwell. Stay on the path. Do not stop." Little Red Riding Hood promised, pulled on her cloak, and set off. The forest was quiet. The trees stood close together, their branches crossing overhead. Light moved slowly across the path as the sun climbed. Not far in, a wolf stepped out from behind a tree. He did not rush. He did not bare his teeth. He spoke politely and asked where she was going. Little Red Riding Hood answered him. He asked where her grandmother lived.
she told him. The wolf smiled and suggested she gather flowers for her grandmother, who would surely enjoy them. Then he stepped aside and let her pass. Little Red Riding Hood left the path. She gathered flowers slowly, choosing the brightest ones. The forest seemed peaceful, and time passed without her noticing. The wolf did not stop. He ran along the path and reached the grandmother's house first. He knocked. When the door opened, he pushed inside. The grandmother was old and weak. She could not escape. The wolf locked her in the small cupboard beside the hearth, then put on her clothes and climbed into her bed. He drew the curtains and waited. When Little Red Riding Hood arrived, she knocked and entered. The room was dim. Her grandmother lay in bed, turned slightly away. She stepped closer. "Grandmother," she said, "what big ears you have." "All the better to hear you with," said the wolf. "What big eyes you have." "All the better to see you with." "What big teeth you have." "All the better to eat you with." The wolf leapt from the bed. Later that day, a huntsman passed by the house. He noticed the door standing open and the silence inside. He stepped in carefully. The wolf lay on the bed, breathing heavily, his shape wrong beneath the blankets. The huntsman raised his knife. The wolf did not wake. The grandmother was found alive, shaken but unharmed, locked in the cupboard beside the hearth. She was wrapped in a blanket and given water. She spoke little, but she lived. Little Red Riding Hood sat beside her until evening came, holding her basket, the flowers crushed and forgotten. When the girl returned home, she said little of what had happened. She wore her red cloak again, but she stayed on the path from then on, and the forest remained what it had always been. The Bremen Town Musicians. Long ago, in a quiet part of the countryside, there lived a donkey who had worked faithfully for many years. He had carried heavy loads along dusty roads, pulled carts through fields, and stood patiently when asked. But as time passed, his strength faded. His steps grew slower, and his work became harder. One day, the donkey overheard his master speaking. "He is no longer of much use," the man said. "It may be time to be rid of him." The donkey understood. That night, he left the farm and set out along the road. He did not know exactly where he was going, but he had heard of a town called Bremen, where musicians were welcomed. He thought that perhaps, if nothing else, he might find a place there. As he walked, the road stretched quietly ahead of him. Before long, he came upon a dog lying by the roadside. The dog was breathing heavily, his head resting on his paws. "What troubles you?" the donkey asked. "I am old," the dog replied. "I have guarded my master's house for many years, but now I can no longer run as I once did. They no longer want me." The donkey nodded. "Come with me," he said. "I am going to Bremen. I plan to become a musician. You can join me." The dog considered this. Then he rose, and together they continued down the road. After a while, they passed a farmyard where a cat sat staring into space. Her fur was dull and her eyes were tired. "What has happened to you?" the donkey asked. "I have grown slow," said the cat. "I once caught mice with ease, but now I prefer to sit by the fire. My owners no longer have patience for me." "Come with us," said the donkey. "We are going to Bremen to make music." The cat thought for a moment, then joined them. As evening drew closer, the three travellers passed a farm where a rooster stood on a gate, calling loudly into the fading light. "Why do you cry so earnestly?" asked the donkey. "I cry because tomorrow I am to be taken away," said the rooster. "My voice no longer pleases them." "Then come with us," said the donkey. "We are bound for Bremen. Your voice will be welcome." So the four set off together. They walked until night fell, and the road grew dim. At last, tired from the journey, they decided to rest in a forest. There, they noticed a small house ahead, with a light glowing from its window. Hungry and curious, they approached quietly. Peering inside, they saw a table set with food. The room was occupied, but not by anyone they trusted. After a moment's thought, the donkey had an idea. They arranged themselves carefully. The donkey stood on its hind legs. The dog climbed onto his back. The cat onto the dog, and the rooster perched at the top. At a signal, they began to make noise, each in their own way. The sound was unexpected and loud enough to startle those inside the house. In confusion, the occupants fled into the night, believing something far worse had arrived. The animals waited. When all was quiet, they entered the house and ate what food remained. Afterwards, they settled down to rest, each finding a place that suited them. The night passed peacefully. In the morning, the animals realized something important. They were warm, fed, and safe. The road to Bremen suddenly seemed much longer than it had before. After some thought, they decided to stay. They made the house their home, living together quietly, each contributing what they could. They did not become musicians in the town of Bremen, but they had found something better. They had found a place where they were no longer judged by what they could not do, and there they remained, content in each other's company.